Order, order. We now begin public proceedings of the Education Select Committee. This morning we are holding our pre-appointment hearing for Sir Ian Bauckham, the government's preferred candidate for the Chief Regulator of Ofqual. You're welcome this morning, Sir Ian.
Thank you very much.
Can I begin our questions by asking what led you to apply for the Chief Regulator position on a permanent basis? And what relevant experience will you be bringing to the role?
Thank you. I've spent a career in education. I became a teacher at the beginning of my career, spent more or less 20 years in the classroom, and then had a variety of leadership roles in schools through the remainder of that time. I was fortunate to have the opportunity to undertake some national leadership roles. For example, I was in the presidential team of the Association of School and College Leaders for 3 years and president for 1 year, and roles like that took me into many different kinds of schools and colleges in different contexts up and down the country. I think that gave me a significant degree both of insight and personal credibility to undertake this role. But it also importantly taught me the supreme importance of having qualifications which are of good value, properly regulated, trustworthy, because qualifications accredit the learning. They act as a kind of currency, a portable currency of learning for students who undertake educational programs in schools and colleges. And so, as the committee will know, I've been undertaking this role on an interim basis for almost a year now, and when the opportunity became available to apply for it on a permanent basis, I did so because I think that deep knowledge of education in different contexts, different parts of England, and also the expertise in and knowledge of the qualifications world, how qualifications work, that I gleaned from my 3 years as chairing the board of Ofqual, make me very well qualified to undertake the role. It would be the honour of my life to be confirmed in this post, and I think particularly so because Ofqual acts as an independent regulator, which I think is a very good structure for assuring the credibility of our qualifications.
Thank you very much. If you are appointed on a permanent basis, what do you expect to be the things that will challenge you the most in the role? I expect to continue to be challenged by some of the things that have challenged me this year. The day job, the supremely important day job of Ofqual, if I can use that term, is to deliver qualifications in each annual cycle in a way which is safe and secure for students. So that means anticipating possible problems, hitches, threats, risks to qualifications delivery and to their trustworthiness. So that is not an easy job, and we can say a little bit more about that later if that question is useful. But continuing to do that, but doing it also in an evolving policy landscape. And I think the policy landscape is always evolving and will continue to evolve over the next 5 years for a range of reasons. Thank you. Can you tell us what you've learned over the last year in the interim role of Chief Regulator?
Yes, I think probably one of the central lessons I've learned is that issues in qualifications and assessment are often complex and often not what they seem at first sight. And sometimes, particularly in the early days, I was momentarily tempted to rush to judgment on an issue that looked obvious. But on further consideration, research, dialogue with colleagues, it was often the case that an issue was more complex than it seemed at first sight. And if I can just offer one example of that, it's the question of digitisation in high-stakes qualifications. I think many people would say that because the world is digitising very rapidly at the moment, then qualifications should digitise at the same speed at the point of taking the qualification in schools. However, when you peel away at that and look under the surface, and we've done a very significant piece of research in this space during my year as interim chief regulator, you discover that actually there are very significant risks in a hasty digitisation plan for the entire qualifications system, largely to do with equity and fairness and the different impacts of different ways of answering questions in assessments or examinations on students. So more complexity than often there seems at first sight.
Thank you. And what have been your major achievements in the last year as interim regulator?
I think I probably have to say the delivery of qualifications safely. We are the qualifications regulator. We regulate about 246 different awarding organisations over a huge range of qualifications, over 10,000 qualifications. And this summer we delivered A-levels, AS levels and GCSEs to about 1.3 million students. Papers marked by a workforce of approximately 72,000 examiners across the country, and in addition about 800,000 vocational and technical qualifications of those that are offered specifically in the summer series, and did so this summer without major incident or difficulty. And in fact, the feedback that we had following this summer series was that it was one of the smoothest series on record, and that includes before the pandemic. So I think I probably have to count that as the number one achievement, because that is the principal purpose of our role. There have been some others as well, which are perhaps more specific. We've been working on a counter-fraud program this year. So qualifications fraud is a very significant issue in qualifications. It's a big market, and in areas such as on-site construction, qualifications relating to the nighttime economy, security, English when it's used for immigration purposes. Areas like that are very susceptible to qualifications fraud. So we've led, and I chaired a couple of weeks ago, a panel of industry leaders, including also the Home Office, with an obvious interest in the immigration question, to bear down on qualifications fraud and get the sector to take this even more seriously and put in place measures to reduce it. So I've been very pleased with pieces of work like that.
Very much.
Thank you, Chair. We know that arm's length bodies and regulators are at their best when they're leading the public debate. So what will you do, Sir Ian, to ensure Ofqual leads the public debate in this area?
Thank you. Absolutely. So leading the public debate is something we absolutely aspire to do. I think there are probably three principles that would underpin my approach to doing this. I think we have a responsibility to assure the public about the value of qualifications, the public and the students who take and hold those qualifications, and indeed the teachers who teach them. So assurance of the value of qualifications will be the first. The second is to do, I think, with explanation and information, because assurance at the right time needs to be backed up with detailed explanation, detailed information to demonstrate why what we're saying about the value and importance of a qualification holds true. And the third is to do with listening, and I think listening to the public, listening to the sector, by which I mean schools, colleges and others who teach, and listening to students, being attentive to potential shifts in public mood, for specific feedback about different aspects of qualifications, and responding to that as well. And all of those three things, so assurance, explanation and information, and listening and responding, I would aspire to do through a range of different media, as a range of different appropriate times in the qualifications cycle. I think there is a particular importance in the summer, at the time when so many young people are getting qualifications, to provide assurance that those qualifications that they've been working so hard for, students and teachers also teaching students for, are valid and worthwhile. So if we look back at this year, for example, I undertook a number of engagements in the media, radio, television, the online media, and also the printed media. I wrote an op-ed in one of the national newspapers that was published on the day of GCSE results, primarily centred around the importance of assuring young people and the public that qualifications are worthwhile. I think at other points in the cycle, we can build understanding by explaining why we assess the way we do, what kinds of approaches to assessment best suit different kinds of circumstances, different kinds of knowledge or skills, and importantly also how grading takes place in GCSEs and A-levels. And that's a useful segue into just a brief comment, if I may, Chair, on the third point, the listening and responding. So in dialogue with the Association of School and College Leaders and its current General Secretary, I learnt this summer that there was a degree of confusion among school leaders, their members, about the way in which grading happens at GCSEs and A-levels. So hearing that feedback and reflecting on it, it seemed to me that it would be opportune to work with ASCL and produce a product in which I and the General Secretary of ASCL dialogued about the way in which grading happens, and I was in a position to explain how it happened and explain the benefits of the approach to grading that we take now, and for that to be made available to ASCL members and ultimately to the public. So that's just an example of that listen and explain.
That's very comprehensive. I suppose, could you give us an overview of how you see Ofqual's public profile, its reputation, whether you think it is not where you want it to be, and how it can be improved?
I think there is always room for improvement. I think following the difficult events of 2020 and 2021, which are a matter of public record, clearly, Ofqual has made a very strong recovery, and our perceptions survey work that we undertake to gauge public opinion, public perceptions of qualifications, and Ofqual in particular, tells us that Ofqual is trusted by the public. Of course, as I said at the beginning of my answer, there is always room for improvement, and I will anticipate improving further the levels of trust in which Ofqual is held by engaging in the stakeholder engagements that I described in my earlier answer vigorously, sensitively, at the right time, in the right place, to the right audiences, to get those messages across.
Thank you, Chair. Sir Ian, what will be your main immediate priorities upon taking up the role in January?
Again, I probably have to say the safe delivery of next summer's qualifications cycle. So that spans GCSEs, AS levels and A levels. The demographic is growing, so we have a slightly larger population of 16 to 18-year-olds next year. As I alluded to earlier, there are always threats to the safe delivery of qualifications and the maintenance of standards, and so being very clear in our risk assessment of those threats and risks, and dealing with each one individually as it arises, preempting it. That will be my first priority. I think also we are potentially on the threshold of a period of some reforms in qualifications, both in vocational and technical qualifications, and also in GCSEs and A-levels that we call together general qualifications. So I think it's not yet completely clear what the direction of travel will be in specific terms, but that is beginning to emerge, so doing early work to make sure that we are ready for a period of reform that may come out of decisions taken by the government will also be a significant priority. And there are also issues to do with the rise in technology, which I think we continue to need to be attentive to. I could say a little bit more about artificial intelligence, but that might be something we come on to later.
And we will do.
All right.
And I will certainly be coming onto that. So looking forward a little bit more than the immediate priorities, what will be your long-term priorities for Ofqual for the 5 years?
So to continue to enhance Ofqual as an effective regulator that has the interests of both students and society and the economy at its heart, that will have led, I think, by the end of 5 years, successful reforms in the light of evolving policy decisions, which is ever more trusted by the public and by students as the guardian of safe, fair, trustworthy qualifications for everybody, and also as a guardian of fairness in qualifications. Fairness is at the heart of our mission, ensuring that everybody is on a level playing field when it comes to taking assessments and achieving qualifications.
Thank you, Chair. So, Serian, if appointed, you will be the 5th Chief Regulator in 4 years. How will you work to restore confidence in Ofqual for both those within and outside of the organisation?
Yes. I know and have spoken to all previous chief regulators about the role. I think it's probably fair to say that the higher than average turnover in chief regulators in recent years has been largely, though not exclusively, due to the pandemic. I think the way in which I would restore trust, in addition to points that I made earlier about a laser focus on effective communications, delivery of reform and fairness, in addition to all of that, simply remaining in post for the full duration of the appointment will help to restore stability, because I think consistency of message, consistency of leadership, a familiar voice and face in stakeholder engagement and media engagement, continuing to repeat the important messages about the supreme importance of our qualifications being a trustworthy currency of the education which so many people work so hard for.
Thank you. So you've spoken to your predecessors. What advice have they given you?
They've told me to pace myself. It's a big job and a lot needs doing. and quite a lot seems sometimes to be urgent. So careful prioritisation to make sure that we do the big things first, the important things first, but don't neglect the other things, of course, they need to come, but we have to operate within a certain human and financial resource envelope. So prioritising the priorities, doing the important things.
Thank you. And my last question, have you discussed any expectations on how long you expect to be in post?
Yes, I expect to be in post if confirmed for the full period, 5 years.
Thank you.
Caroline.
Thank you, Chair. Sir Ian, we've seen over the last 5 years there have been significant variations in grading due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then efforts since to address that grade inflation. So are you confident that students are now being assessed to the same standard as they were pre-pandemic?
The very short answer to that question is yes, but allow me to give a little bit more context, if I may, Chair. So in the immediate return to normal after the pandemic, so in 2023, we put in place transitional arrangements to, in a sense, ease the return to normal assessments for students following 2022, got my years muddled up, 2022, to ease the transition of students back into normal assessments following the disruption of the pandemic, and they had various supports at that time, including advance notice and so on, and also a midway grading standard. From 2023 and in 2024, we returned to a normal grading standard, and I am absolutely clear that that is a comparable grading standard to the grading standard used before the pandemic. We can see that through a number of sources of evidence. First of all, expert examiner judgment is an important part of the grading process. So when examiners meet to discuss marked scripts and look at possible grade boundaries, they're able to compare the standard achieved in exam scripts with the standards achieved in previous years by using archived scripts. And what examiners across the different awarding organisations and across the different subjects are telling us is that those standards are, in their judgment, comparable. Second piece of evidence is grade boundaries themselves and where they end up. Now, it's important to note that there is always some small variation in grade boundaries across subjects and across awarding organisations from year to year, occasioned by slight changes in the difficulty of any particular paper from year to year. But when you look across the piece at all subjects, all awarding organisations, we see grade boundaries that are now in broadly the same place as they were before the pandemic. So that's a second piece of assurance that we are back to a normal grading standard. And then I think a third piece of evidence would be the results of the national reference tests. So every year since 2017, Ofqual has run a reference test administered to a scientifically selected representative sample of Year 11 students in February, March of Year 11 in English and Maths, so to gauge the underlying performance standard in those two subjects in the lead up to the GCSEs themselves, to make sure that standards are not drifting and they're actually pegged to a stable standard. And what we've seen since 2017 is some fluctuation, and we saw some modest falls in achievements during the pandemic years. But actually the overall picture is one, broadly speaking, of stability. We haven't seen dramatic fluctuations in that underlying performance standard. So when you put all of this together and we look at the methodology that exam boards use to set standards, I am able to say with confidence that the grading standard that we used in 2023 and 2024 is directly comparable to the grading standard used before the pandemic.
I ask a second. Yeah, so it was interesting in the pandemic year that grades went up when it was down to teacher assessment, and some might say teachers were just being generous because it was a difficult time. But how does that, did that make you reflect at all on the exam system, and whether at GCSE level perhaps it might be better to have more input from teachers about how kids are doing rather than relying solely on an exam?
So I was in the unusual and potentially privileged position of being having one foot in the school camp and one foot in the Ofqual camp at that time, so saw what was playing out at first hand in schools. And look, the first thing I want to say is that it was an incredibly challenging time for teachers and for schools. And I think teachers and schools up and down the country did their level best to act with integrity and award grades in the way that they saw fit for the achievement of their students. Whether there were elements of particular sympathy occasioned by the pandemic underlying teachers and schools' actions, it's really impossible for me to say. It's not impossible. I think my view still remains that for high-stakes assessments, and by high stakes I mean assessments that are used for progression purposes, sometimes competitive progression purposes, and which are also used for accountability for schools and in some cases even individual teachers and head teachers. Having an objective system for assessments which puts everybody on the level playing field, on a level playing field, where examinations are marked anonymously, in fact, by a range of different examiners. What happens when an exam script arrives at an exam board is essentially it's scanned, cut up. Individual examiners may mark a small subset of questions across many, many candidates. So every candidate's script is marked by multiple examiners, and all of that is done anonymously. And the marks are then aggregated at national level for that awarding organisation and that qualification, and that is then fed into the grading process. That feels to me like the fairest, most even-handed way to assess young people for qualifications which are of such critical importance both to them and to the teachers and schools and colleges who teach them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Sirian, for your answers so far. So turning now to RAC. Exam boards recognised that RAC had an adverse effect on coursework and then extended the deadlines as a result. And I know that you are on record as having pushed back against other uplifts, such as the 10% exam uplift that Durham University research suggested. So given those two things, how did you evaluate the risk posed to students' academic prospects?
So RAC, again, was another difficult episode, hot on the heels of the pandemic. I remember when the RAC story broke back in the August, at the beginning of the last academic year. Again, I was still running schools at the time, so the first thing I wanted to assure myself of was that all of the schools I was responsible for were safe. Having done that and turning to the RAC question and the way in which it affected exams, we were clear from the outset that as much support as possible should be put in to schools that were badly affected by RAC. Many schools were affected in many different ways, some profound and long-lasting, others much less so. So, as you've alluded to, there were extensions to non-examined assessment completion put in place. There were contacts given to schools, to advisors who could offer information and support for schools. In extremis, it was made clear to schools that if it was not possible to complete a whole component of an assessment for a qualification, then the part of the assessment that students could complete could be used to award the qualification. So all of that was done to provide as much support as possible for those schools. We have a priority to ensure that the qualification system is even-handed and fair for everybody across the country, and that qualifications awarded accredit learning which has been demonstrated by students at the point of assessment. One of the things we learnt both during the pandemic and in other ways is that accrediting learning which we have not seen demonstrated in a way which is fair and even-handed across the system is an incredibly difficult, I would say impossible thing to do. For example, during the pandemic, we heard a number of calls to differentially adjust the outcomes for students in areas of the country, in schools, which were differentially affected by the pandemic. And that ask was taken seriously, worked through. The conclusion of it was that there are so many different impacts on students and on schools that attempting to make a fair adjustment for all of them in a way which would be even-handed is an impossible thing to do. One of the truisms about achievement in education is that there are always more differences within a school than there are even between schools and between regions. So in the end, we came back to our statutory objective, which is to ensure that qualifications results accurately and consistently represent the achievement of young people at the point of assessment in a way which is fair and comparable both across years and between awarding organisations, and decided that we couldn't make that kind of adjustment for schools that had been impacted by RAC in a range of different ways.
Of course, no, that makes sense. And you've already answered this part in part. So what pressure was placed on you to allow a special uplift for students in schools affected by RAC?
Yeah, so there were requests to consider this from a variety of sources. Some of those came through the media, some of them came through media outlets. I personally met with one member of Parliament who had a school in her constituency that she wanted me to talk about. I was open to meeting any member who wished to discuss any particular case in their constituency. I met with that one member. And we had a lengthy discussion where we stepped through all of this thinking, all of these difficulties. I can't honestly say there was a meeting of minds at the end of that, but I did my best to represent our view with integrity and explain the rationale for the position we were taking.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Serena.
Thank you. So Ian, we touched very briefly on the challenges posed by artificial intelligence within education, and you also included those challenges in your responses to the committee's questionnaire. So how will you lead Ofqual to effectively respond as this technology develops?
So artificial intelligence and other aspects of technology, but I'll focus particularly on AI for now, is a very big issue for us, and we've initiated a programme of research to understand in depth what the implications of AI, particularly for qualifications and assessment, are. Let me just explore a couple of different angles here. The first one is the use of AI for the assessment of student work. So the position that we've taken at the moment, and I think probably I have to say at the moment in front of any answer to do with AI, because the picture is changing rapidly, and what seems imperative at the moment might not always be imperative, but at the moment it seems to us imperative that a human oversees the marking of student work. That's for a range of reasons. AI still makes mistakes. It hallucinates. There's lots and lots of evidence of that. Decisions made by AI evaluating a piece of work that a student has produced for a high-stakes assessment are less transparent and therefore less open to challenge than they might be if marked by a human. You can't easily ask a computer to explain to you why it's made a judgment about the marking of your work in a way that you can ask an examiner to explain that. There's also a public confidence dimension here. We've carefully sampled public confidence and attitudes in this space. And in the area, and I speak only for my own area, not for other areas of public life, but in qualifications, the public overwhelmingly wants a human being to oversee the marking of students' work. Now, none of that is to say that AI can't be used for other purposes. So it can be used, for example, for the quality assurance of the examining process. It can sample, it can check, it can do arithmetical checks, it can retrieve samples of similar answers, it can compare them. There are lots and lots of useful, helpful, quality improving things AI can do, but marking work itself must be overseen by a human being.
Could you clarify that you are referring to awarding organisations?
Yes.
As well as individual teachers within
Yes.
the classroom?
So I'm talking here principally about awarding organisations. So JCQ, which is the collective, if you like, of the exam boards, have issued separate guidance to schools and to teachers on the use of AI for non-examined assessment or coursework, which is submitted. We have put in place, Ofqual has put in place a condition that requires exam boards to have effective and appropriate measures in place to guard against work being claimed as a student's own when in fact it's been generated by AI. So there are some of the things that we've done in relation to schools and the role of teachers and schools. I was just going to come on briefly, if I may, Chair, to say something briefly about awarding organisations and how they might use AI more broadly in the exam system. So there is potential, I think, for some very exciting uses of AI for the generation of question papers, for comparing question papers year on year, generating question papers which are broadly comparable in difficulty from one year to the next is labour intensive, difficult, requires subject experts, multiple layers of subject experts and quality assurance to get right. It may well be that AI can support with that. And my judgment would be that there are fewer risks to public confidence there, providing a human is in the loop for final sign-off, than in the actual marking of student work. But as I said earlier, all of this is at the moment. If you ask me to look in a crystal ball and say, what will AI be doing in 5 or 10 years' time, I'd be very reticent to make any specific commitments.
Okay, and additional to that, what support is Ofqual providing to schools and teachers within this space?
Yeah, so we asked exam boards to make sure that exam boards asked them to make sure that they had appropriate measures in place to detect plagiarism occasioned by AI, and we asked them also to produce guidance for schools so that schools understood their responsibilities when it came to guiding students in the production of coursework on non-examined assessment and in the detection of work produced potentially by AI rather than by the agency of the student themselves, because the underlying principle here remains that qualifications must represent the actual skills, knowledge and understanding of the student taking the qualification, not the skills, knowledge and understanding of the aggregated internet. That isn't the same thing. That isn't an educational outcome for the individual.
Mark, you had a supplementary.
Yeah, just as a follow-up, so some of those answers are absolutely fascinating, especially the ones about generating questions using AI. But I just wanted to clarify something. You've said repeatedly that a human must oversee the marking of student work. When you say that, do you mean that a human should always be involved and actually mark the work? Or do you see a process or procedure where AI might mark the work and then a human checks it?
In the vast majority of cases, it will be a human actually looking at the scripts.
Okay. Got you. And is there a minority of cases where AI will look at the scripts?
There may be some very simple selective response items, so multiple choice questions, which can be safely marked by a machine, but we would still expect a human to be in the loop, checking that was happening, sampling quality and so on.
Absolutely. So you're talking exclusively about multiple choice questions. You're not talking about scripts or say English assessments where somebody has written paragraphs.
And the vast majority of assessments, if I may just add, Chair, at GCSE and A level involve some degree of extended writing. And so we would always expect a human to be involved in gauging the quality of that writing and the level that the student was working at. For the reasons I evinced earlier, it's very difficult to challenge a machine's decision. Most of this AI is based on large language models, which are essentially predictive models about the most likely next word. How do you ask a computer why it's given a particular mark to a piece of extended writing based on that? It's just not transparent and open enough to challenge. And the challenge is a key thing. Marking and grading must be open to challenge in a transparent system. So it must be possible for a candidate or their school to say, I want to see my mark script and I don't agree with that marking. I would like another human being to look at it. And that's much harder to do if extended writing has been machine marked.
Thank you so much.
Jess.
Thank you, Syrian. You told us in your response to our questionnaire that you'll have a strong focus on vocational and technical qualifications. What is your assessment of the success of T-levels since their launch in September 2020?
Thank you. So T-levels are a very new and different qualification type in a range of different ways. They're large qualifications, essentially designed to be full-time for the students taking them at level 3, normally between 16 and 18. I've spent part of this year visiting schools and colleges up and down the country, and many of the colleges I've visited have got classes of students taking T-levels. And before we get on to some of the issues with T-levels, because issues there are, of course, I think it's probably helpful just to put down a marker that says overwhelmingly the students and teachers whom I've talked with who have been teaching or taking T-levels have spoken overwhelmingly positively about them. And teachers have told me about the transformative power that the T-level is beginning to demonstrate with students who want a vocational route for their studies, who value a high-quality work placement as part of that route, and are able to make a decision about the particular occupational route that they want to follow at the age of 16. And that segues into one of the challenges. So one of the challenges with T-levels is that because they are large qualifications, it's not possible to combine them with other qualifications as it is in other parts of the vocational and technical landscape. So if you're a 16-year-old, you do have to be in a position to make a decision about a particular occupational route. I think that's one of the reasons why the inception of T-levels has been relatively incremental. Slow, I could say. At the beginning, there were only around 7,000 T-level completers this summer. T-level deliberately pitched to be at a demanding level in order to have some level of parity with A-levels, which is the other level 3 route, which T-level candidates may also be considering. There's also a significant amount of content and a significant assessment burden in T-levels. So I think all of these and other issues are probably areas, and I should perhaps have said at the beginning that the Department for Education takes principal responsibility rather than Ofqual for the design and delivery of T-levels. We regulate the core and specialism bits of the T-level, but the other parts are overseen by the Department for Education. So it would be they who would be leading a reform. I think it would be possible to make a convincing case to improve, streamline, simplify in some ways T-levels to establish their role more solidly in the market for young people. But I do just want to circle back to my opening remark, because I don't want in any sense to be misconstrued as saying that T-levels are not successful. For the students who are taking them, they absolutely are successful, but they are a very small part of the market at the moment.
Thank you. More than 1 in 4 students didn't complete their T-level studies this year. What, in your view, needs to be done to improve the quality and effectiveness of the qualification?
Yes, that's a worrying figure, isn't it? I think there are probably multiple reasons why that has happened in the early days of a new qualification. The first is probably associated with just the newness of the qualification and its pitching in difficulty terms at such a high level for a vocational and technical qualification in this space. I think probably some students were surprised at the burden and the level that was being asked of them in T-levels. I think it's probably also the case that some, mainly colleges, but schools as well, and teachers didn't have sufficiently good quality and coherent support for teaching them. If you want to, and this is me with my Ofqual hat off for a moment and a wider educational hat on, if you want to get success in a particular program of study, you need to have in place features like a well worked out, clearly sequenced curriculum. We know what it is we're teaching, we know in what order. You need very well trained teachers that deeply understand the content that they're teaching and how they're going to go about teaching it. And you need really well-tailored teaching materials to enable the teachers to put into practice their knowledge of the curriculum with their in-depth understanding of the requirements. So without those 3 key features, there will be faltering in the early delivery. And I wonder, and this is outside my brief as Chief Regulator, I should make clear, but I wonder whether all of that was sufficiently strongly in place at the beginning. However, I think that with the right kind of reform, within the T-level envelope, T-levels, I remain an optimist about this, can be enabled to grow and flourish and succeed. You may want to explore with me, perhaps in a future question, whether I think that T-levels should be the only part of the vocational and technical qualifications landscape. I'll save my answers to that question for the future, just in case you want to ask me that. But that's where I am on T-levels.
Yes,
I'm very happy for
I
you
think
to.
we'd like to ask you that question.
Yeah.
And should you think that T-level should be the only qualification in the future landscape of qualifications?
One of the unique, almost unique features of T-levels in the VTQ, vocational and technical qualifications landscape, is that they are explicitly and specifically allied to the occupational standards in the particular occupational area that they provide a qualification for. That isn't the case for the majority of other vocational and technical qualifications in the landscape. There is no nationally defined standard or content for those qualifications. So people talk a lot about BTECs. I should use the term Applied General Qualification, because BTEC, as you know, is a brand name that belongs to one awarding organisations, but it's the popular shorthand for those kinds of qualifications. I think probably the main obstacle to T-levels being the only feature of the landscape in that vocational and technical space is probably its size. I think having a qualification which is underpinned by an occupational standard is therefore anchored in some objective content that we know commands the confidence of the industry concerned is a good thing. But I think quite simply there are young people at age 16 who are not yet sufficiently certain about the area they want to go into to commit to an all-or-nothing option, which is what T-levels represent. And therefore, I think it will, and I don't want to prejudge the recommendations of the Curriculum and Assessment Review that will be debating this, but I think arguments will certainly be made for the inclusion of smaller, nonetheless rigorous, nonetheless good quality, nonetheless also pinned to occupational standards so that we know they're industry relevant, but smaller qualifications in that landscape as well to allow some flexibility of combination for students.
Thank you. And we'll go to Darren.
Sirian, you're obviously seeking confirmation as the Chief Regulator of Ofqual. You've just mentioned the Department for Education's very important Curriculum and Assessment Review, and you're a member of the review board of that. How do you see those roles kind of playing out together? Do you foresee any challenges?
I think as far as the Curriculum and Assessment Review is concerned, I'd offer the following comments. I'm an observer member of that panel, so I'm in a position to provide expert advice on qualifications and assessment to the panel's deliberations, which I have been doing, I hope helpfully hitherto. I won't be part of the decision-making process of that review, so I won't be a signatory to the recommendations, thus putting some distance between Ofqual and the recommendations of the review. The recommendations of the review, of course, would still need to be accepted into government policy, so in other words, be accepted by ministers, and that will be a matter for ministers to consider when the recommendations are on the table, and I wouldn't want in any sense to cross the line into that space. That's not my role, but I hope what I am able to do is offer effective advice and guidance, and also, I think, contribute to the marshalling of the very significant expertise and experience that Ofqual has in qualifications and assessment, and indeed in qualifications reform, to bring that to bear on the deliberations of the Curriculum and Assessment Review. But I should perhaps at this point underline that Ofqual, as a non-ministerial government department, is accountable directly to Parliament via the offices of this committee, not to government or to government ministers. And that's a very important distinction for me to underline, I think, at this point in the discussion. It's for government to make decisions about qualifications policy, and to oversee the provision of education, including the quality of teachers, the resourcing of schools and colleges, the training of teachers, decisions about the curriculum, what children and young people should be taught. All of that sits in the domain of the Department for Education. When it comes to assessment, the decision that Parliament made in 2009 when Ofqual was established was that assessment should be regulated independently from the Department for Education, from their influence, or indeed from the appearance of influence. So it's very important that distinction of roles is respected, in my view.
Thank you. There are a couple of helpful distinctions that you made there. Specifically on reforms, obviously the previous government sought to reform post-16 qualifications, and we've spoken a bit about how they sought to make A levels and T levels the sort of main FE qualification options, but that's now under review. What, in your view, has been the impact of that uncertainty? And we've heard from other experts in the sector of that uncertainty. What, in your view, has been the impact of that on Ofqual?
So I'll talk about the broader impact of uncertainty first. I mean, I've certainly heard, as I'm sure you will have done from previous witnesses, when visiting particularly colleges, but also some schools, and I recall particularly a school I visited in Gloucestershire earlier on in the summer that has a sixth form with a very large contingent of students taking vocational and technical qualifications who were concerned that they didn't know what the future of those qualifications would be. So that has certainly caused uncertainty. I think what I would say is that as an organisation we would respect and welcome any work on qualifications in the 16 to 18 phase, which aims to simplify, improve quality, improve clarity and navigability for students taking those qualifications. I said in my answer to an earlier question that I think some diversity was probably still going to be needed in that qualification space because of the size of T levels, the all or nothing nature of them. I understand that the government is going to be making an announcement about the outcomes of its review of qualifications that were due for imminent defunding very soon. So I don't want in any sense to be seen to be preempting that announcement. But I think the only way to deal with this, given that we're on a journey, both a journey towards the establishment and growth of T levels, but also a journey towards potential reform of other vocational and technical qualifications in that space, is to consider what needs to happen on a year-by-year basis, with an eye both to designing a future landscape that we want to get to, so clarity about the desired end state, but also very much thinking of schools, colleges and students who are in the system now and want and need to teach and take qualifications now. And I think that can probably only be addressed by taking a granular approach, qualification by qualification, and making decisions on that basis.
On the review that you've just mentioned, the current review, what engagement have you had with the Department for Education on that?
So Ofqual's role is to provide expert advice on qualifications and on the awarding organisations that offer them. We're primarily the regulator of awarding organisations, so know those organisations well. We're also an expert organisation in qualifications and assessment. We participated in the first wave of the review of qualifications that was paused following the general election, and our role in that was to evaluate qualifications, literally qualification by qualification, as requested, and provide feedback to the government. But the funding of qualifications, so in other words, the decision about whether a qualification can be delivered in a state-funded institution in England, that decision rests squarely with the Department for Education. So we're not involved directly in funding decisions.
The findings of your assessment of those qualifications will have been on the table when they make those decisions.
They will absolutely have been on the table, along with a range of other considerations, and the department will, I don't want to risk speaking for them, but I'll venture to say they will also have been considering questions like enrolment. So there are qualifications with very low or in some cases even zero enrolment. They will have been considering issues of replication, duplication of qualifications in a closely allied field, alongside the qualitative information that we will have been giving them about the qualification following evaluation.
I just have a final question, Sir Ian, which is about SEND, which is an issue in which this committee is taking a great interest. And we're seeing rapidly increasing diagnoses of a variety of different special educational needs amongst students who are taking exams, and increasing numbers of students being assessed as being eligible for extra time in taking exams. And I just wondered whether you've got views about the interaction between that trend and the way that assessments are being undertaken, whether the current framework is fit for purpose for increasing levels of SEND in our schools.
Yes, a couple of thoughts in response to that question, Chair. I think the first thing I would say is that awarding organisations, awarding qualifications are under a legal obligation under equalities legislation to make reasonable adjustments for students with special educational needs or disabilities. They do that in a variety of ways. They do it through enlarged, modified papers on different colours. They do it through additional time, through the use of scribes, readers, separate, smaller space to alter the atmosphere in which qualifications are taken. And as an organisation, we impose a requirement on awarding organisations to ensure that they comply with equalities law and make those reasonable adjustments available. It is true to say that we have seen an increase in recent years in the use of those reasonable adjustments. It's not clear exactly why that is happening, other than to note that we do have rising levels of SEND in the system. JCQ, so the collective organisation for exam boards, undertakes visits and inspections of centres during the exam season, and one of the things they monitor is the way in which centres routinely administer adjustments made under the equalities requirement, and there has been no systemic, I should say, sense that provision is being misused. I think I would circle back to a point that I made earlier to say that ensuring that all students are objectively assessed on the knowledge, skills and understanding that they have acquired during their course in a way which is fair and level for all students across the piece sits at the heart of our mission. That's in line with our statutory objectives to ensure that standards are maintained between awarding organisations and across years. So I would assert that the criticality of those fair assessments for all is still paramount.
Thank you very much. Sir Ian, thank you very much for attending the committee this morning. That concludes our public proceedings. Order, order.
Thank you.
Thank you.